Today on The Big Questions, is the time coming to lay the Holocaust to rest? Good morning, good to see you. I'm Nicky Campbell. Welcome to The Big Questions. We're live from Media City, UK in Salford to debate one question, one very big question. Is the time coming to lay the Holocaust to rest? 11 million people died in the Nazi Holocaust. 6 million were Jews, half of them Polish. 3 million Polish Catholics also perished, as did millions of Slavs, Asiatics, Roma, Russians, homosexuals, and mentally ill and disabled people. Many, many more suffered in the camps or were forced to flee their homelands. And it wasn't just the Nazis who were responsible for the suffering. Others turned refugees away. Others took no action when given reports of the atrocities. It was perhaps the cruelest example of man's inhumanity to man. But as the last remaining survivors pass away and the last of the old men stand trial for their crimes, will the time come when the world can finally lay the Holocaust to rest? To contemplate that once unthinkable thought, we have assembled teachers, philosophers, historians, humanitarians, rabbis, survivors, and those whose job it is to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive. And you can have your say too via Twitter or online. Just log on to bbc.co.uk/thebigquestions, where you'll find links to continue the discussion online. Lots of contributions from our intelligent and informed Salford audience too. So is the time coming to lay the Holocaust to rest? Angela Epstein, a British Jewish woman, 2015, living in Manchester. You know, people say, what about the Rwandan genocide, the Armenian genocide, Pol Pot, the millions he killed, the millions, the world's greatest in terms of scale mass murderer, Mao, the victims of Stalin, the colonial genocides in Africa, incalculable human suffering. Why do you believe this is unique?
I think the Holocaust stands unprecedented in the annals of human history because with the Holocaust you had industrialised murder on a scale that hadn't been seen before, sponsored by the state. It wasn't in pursuit of political gain or territorial expansion. The Nazis in power, the government in power, imagine the British government in power, God forbid doing this, simply wanted to annihilate every man, woman, child, every baby in arms, throw them into the gas chambers, regardless of who they were and what they stood for. And let's be clear, there were lots of very, very loyal Germans who had fought very loyally for their country in the First World War. It didn't matter. As far as Germany, an enlightened country, culturally very on point, scientifically advanced, had every reason to defeat any arguments about this being entirely tribal.
Why are the technological methods relevant? Why is the state of a country in terms of scientific advancement relevant? That the suffering is the same. And surely the Armenian genocide, for one, was state-sponsored.
Because if you look at the intellectual advancement of the German people, it was the cultural seat of Europe. You had a people here who were, as you say, on the forefront and all these different artistic, scientific, cultural fronts, and yet they were all focused entirely on removing or annihilating an entire religious people. And it's taken 70 years to repopulate the Jewish community. 6 million Jews died. We've now only replenished that number of people. And this was purely because they were Jewish.
If you're a Tutsi in Rwanda and your family's hacked to death, there is an absolute equivalence of suffering.
This isn't about competitive persecution. It's not saying somebody's drop of blood is more painful than somebody else's. What we're saying about the uniqueness of the Holocaust, and that's the question, it's not that we should deny these other atrocities and genocides. The uniqueness of the Holocaust is this was not political. It was purely to kill the Jewish people and annihilate them.
Could I add one caveat? One caveat. The extermination of the Jewish people was part of a Nazi master plan for the purification of the Aryan race, to get rid of all what it deemed to be genetic and racial inferiors.
Subhuman.
That's right. Yeah. So the mass murder of Jewish people and also the killing of gay people, Roma, Slavic people and so on, was also part of that same grand plan. The intensity and sheer numbers involved with Jewish people was exceptional.
Ideological
but it was all
focus.
part of the same plan.
Absolutely, but it's the exceptional nature of it.
This word, the exceptional nature of it, and you used the word as well, unique.
Yes.
I want to explore this with Tom Lawson, first of all, if I may, Neera, historian at Northumbria University. Now, you know, in its enormity, in its planning, little men formulating railway timetables to get people to the camps, the industrial nature of it, the attempted extermination of an entire race. Maybe it stands apart, but does it trouble you, the use of this word unique?
Yeah, I think it's deeply troubling, because I think that people use the word unique because they mean uniquely important. I mean, in a sense, every historical event is unique. To say something is unique is in a sense meaningless. So I think that and I have a real issue with the notion that the genocide of the Jews, which is usually what we're talking about here, is somehow uniquely important. I think genocide, it was an example of a broader phenomena of genocide, and it needs to be located within that. You know, thinking historically about it in order to understand it, we need to understand it as part of this broader phenomena, which is, in a sense, a constant presence in the human experience, actually. Genocide has occurred again and again and again, and that's the really troubling thing. In a sense, to declare the Holocaust and to declare the genocide of the Jewish people unique is to actually make it rather less important, because in a sense it is to remove it from history. It is to say that it is rather less challenging, because if you locate it within history more generally, and if you understand genocide as this broad phenomena, it is something that we really have to challenge, to say, why does this happen? Why does it happen again and again? Why particularly has it happened again and again in Europe's 20th century?
Does it stop us from learning the lessons, because there is a focus on this crime against humanity of, you know, absolute enormity, and are we in a way, does it mask us from facing contemporary realities which are comparable?
And in a sense, if something's unique, it has no lessons, actually, because if it's unique, in a sense, it never will, in that reality, happen again.
Those are just semantics. With the greatest of respect, those are just semantics. I didn't in any way suggest that the dropping of any other blood from any other culture in the name of racial purity, as Peter quite rightly said, was any less painful or any less important. We are just looking at it as a cultural issue. We're looking at it as the fact there was an attempt to annihilate a whole people. And we have to look at the depths to which an intelligent nation plumbed, because that then explains everything else that happens in the world. Because if the Germans...
Can I just... One caveat here, I think it's important. Does the use of the word intelligent nation not...
Yes.
Is that potentially patronising?
No, I think it's entirely important. I mean, Hannah Arendt famously said when she covered the Nuremberg trials, she talked to the banality of evil. These were pen pushers and bureaucrats, people who wanted to self-aggrandise themselves.
Well, with respect, I think there's a certain confusion here, isn't there? Because if you're saying, actually... I mean, the Nazi attempt to annihilate all Jews is a quite confined moment in the Nazi project, actually.
But going on during the war, when they're trying to win...
Let Tom develop his point.
You know, are we saying, then, that those people who died before late 1941, before the Nazi state was, in fact, entirely geared to the destruction of the Jewish people, that they're somehow not victims of this Holocaust, this thing that is uniquely important?
Jakob Weiss, I want to bring Dr. Jakob Weiss in, if I may.
1933.
At this point, if I can, there's lots of really interesting people to hear from on this. Dr. Jakob Weiss, do we need to redefine our terms, looking at all the other victims, and also when we consider all the other genocides throughout history which continue?
There were certain unique aspects to the Holocaust, because it was not just the physical annihilation of the Jews, it was the annihilation of Judaism as a religion, as a philosophy, as a civilization. Because the Nazis wanted to exterminate the Jews, because if they knew that they could do that, then they could destroy Christianity as well. Without Judaism, there is no Christianity. If Jesus had been visiting his relatives in Poland in 1940, he would have been killed as well. He was a Jew. All the apostles were Jews. All the disciples were Jews. They would have all been killed. The Nazis uniquely in history, and I am a historian as well, the Nazis uniquely in history wanted to uproot a 2,500, 3,000-year-old civilization from the face of history and destroy all organised religion in Europe and replace it with their pagan, Viking, Wagner's operas, all these things, the Valkyries and all those sorts of things, pagan religion
But if the Tom,
I mean, I think if we're talking about the Holocaust and its scale of destruction, and the expunging of the notion of Judaism, and in a sense I accept that. But actually, the colonial crimes were actually expunged entire peoples, entire languages. The British deprived, if you talk about the situation in Australia, the British deprived entire peoples of the language with which to narrate their suffering. So if that's the scale of uniqueness, the Holocaust wasn't new in that sense. It wasn't unique. It was simply another and extraordinarily significant and on a huge scale, but another of the genocidal attacks on indigenous peoples.
Rabbi Laura, Nikesh, I'll come to you in a moment.
You asked the question, should the Holocaust be laid to rest? No. Any mass extermination where I have someone sitting next to me who's a survivor should not be laid to rest. Not now, not in 100 years or 300 years. That's not how history works. And especially to ask the question now, we have people who survived, thank God, near us, or my husband, who's named after his uncle. Both uncles were killed. You want to say, lay it to rest? It is obscene to lay it to rest.
Does laying it to rest mean pursuing the very last perpetrator or even the tiniest cog in this ghastly wheel to the ends of the earth?
So we have perpetrators who are very active, and we also have bystanders. So the people who are most active should definitely have come to justice. And as you said in the introduction, most of them have died. But yes, there is justice, and that is very important. But the memory of what one person, one individual can do to a child, can do to another person, has to be kept going.
Oscar Gröning is going on trial soon.
Yes.
He was a guard at Auschwitz.
Yep.
He's 93 years old.
Yes. And
is that worth it?
Yes, because Ibi is 91. She is a fantastic, eloquent, articulate woman who is responsible for her actions. So is he at 93.
What
Ibi,
I would like
welcome.
Welcome, thanks. Two things.
Can I just put it into context? You were in Auschwitz towards the end.
I was in Auschwitz from June 1944, and I then into a slave labor camp, and I was eventually liberated on the 1st of April, Easter Sunday. But two things. I want to bring it back to the basis. The extermination of undesirables from the Aryan point of view started with German mentally handicapped people being gassed in 1930. They weren't deemed to be worth living. That's where it all started. As far as this guard is concerned, the question I would like to ask him is, what has he done with his life since then? How has he lived? Has he done anything to redeem his action? And the other question is, why did he do what he did? What was it? Was it to protect his own children? If he hadn't done that, would his children have been killed? As a mother, I think I probably would do anything to protect my children.
And here's the question, and I want to get in a few minutes back to how we memorialise and whether we should broaden it and whether it is possible ever to move on. But you raised a fascinating point. You edged towards the fascinating point, if I can ask you, Ibi, and it's a question, it's the most difficult question in moral question in history. What would you have done? What would I have done if we had been German, part of a military family, if you or I had been sent to be a guard at Auschwitz? What would you have done, Ibi?
To start with, I have no idea. I was brought up in an assimilated German cultural environment. I didn't believe, none of us believed that a thing like concentration camps existed, that a cultural, civilized people would do a thing like this. We thought the only people who did concentration camps were the British in South Africa. We didn't think that...
War, yeah.
I mean, we didn't think this was possible. And it wasn't until I actually arrived in Auschwitz and could smell the fumes, the smell of burning flesh. we realized what we came to. And that I survived is a series of luck, of people helping each other, staying together, because not everybody was bad, not everybody was evil. We should not use a broad brush and say it was all the Germans who did it. There were Slovaks, there were Hungarians, there were Poles, there were all sorts of people who did it. And at the same time, there were people who did good, and we forget that. People who saved people, who prevented people being. What I would have done in the position of the guard, I do not know.
We do not know.
I just cannot answer that question. And I feel genocide, as it is happening, as it's always been happening, to me is in the class of tribal war. What the Germans did was have a machine of death. It was bureaucratically organized. You had somebody giving an order here, somebody carrying it out here. You had people doing little bits in between, none of them accepting responsibility, probably none of them even knowing that they were contributing towards the end result.
But if they had accepted responsibility, realised what was going on, raised objections, they were dead.
They would have died. They would have finished up, like quite a lot of people, like the White Rose movement in Germany, which resisted the thing, who were all shot in 1943, like the priests and the nuns who helped, like the other people who helped, who also finished up in the camp, and they died as well. The question is, would any of us put another person to death to prevent us dying? And that is a very difficult question to answer. And unless we are in a situation like this, we cannot answer it. And as long as human beings will consider the us and them syndrome of people being other than they, until they learn that difference are actually valuable.
Well, I want to come back to you a little bit later on, because you've raised an absolutely vital point, which I think focuses on how we started this discussion, is the too narrow a focus. And Paul, I'm going to come to you in a minute, talking about those disabled people who the regime attempted to exterminate in their grotesque drive towards human perfection. Rabbi Laura, Ibi said, you know, it should not be a them and us, it's an us and us.
That's right.
It's about humanity. We are all victims, we are all perpetrators.
And bystanders.
And bystanders.
That's very important.
It's to say it's about one specific people or race of people, does that not, in a sense, blind us from that powerful and necessary message?
Oh, first of all, Jews aren't a race, because you can convert in and out. We have black Jews, pink Jews. We're not a race. We're a religious civilization. But about one people, it is, I agree with what you're saying about it being unique. What I want to say is, in reaction to what Ibi said about choice, I have absolutely no idea how I'd be as a victim or as a bystander or, as God forbid, as a perpetrator. But we can see that people acted differently. Nations who were allies of the Germans,
but they weren't devils with horns, these people.
No,
they were people like us.
They were people like us. But people like us also acted differently. We have 25,000 righteous amongst the nations. Or in Lithuania, where my family came from, people collaborated very actively with the Germans. So they acted either to help or not to help. When you look another human in the eye, when you look at me, Nikki, and I see you as a human, how could someone do that to someone else? I have absolutely no idea, and I have no idea how to act. I just know that people did act differently, and they have to be our role models.
Paul, I mean, as has been mentioned, this drive towards, you know, the perfect Aryan race, perfect human specimens, it makes one feel quite sick to think about all this. Started with the extermination of disabled people.
It did start with the extermination of disabled people, and it started under a democratically elected government of the extermination of disabled people. And I think there was about 250,000 of us destroyed. The thing is, I think everybody's right. It's not that nobody's wrong. There are different elements. I think it's not that it's unique, it's particular in that it encompassed a whole group of people, a whole range of people that had not been attacked before. Plus, it was a planned, global extermination of Jews, of disabled people. To me, the thing about memorialising that I think is a weakness is that we've ignored key groups, such as the disabled. We all know the poem, First They Came for the Jews. Well, first they came for the disabled, actually. And that's not an attack on Jews, but first they came for us.
And they took people's children away from them to be killed, didn't
Absolutely.
they? To be
And they
euthanized.
experimented on them. They put them in the death camps. They practiced and developed the gas chambers. But to me, the key is that the propaganda that was used then is not that different from now. To me, the lesson from history is not to coerce people, it's to make them want it themselves. So, for example, one of the key messages at the start of the Holocaust, linked to was mercy killing and assisted suicide. It's big now, assisted suicide. We want to introduce it. We wipe out whole groups of disabled people now in our society.
With respect, it's a kind of rather different debate.
No, it isn't. That's the point.
That's your view.
That's the key. That's what they said. That was different. It was disabled people then. Oh, they're different because, of course, it's common sense. They're useless eaters. They're not worth living. Well, that's exactly what we say now as we wipe out 95% of people with Down syndrome, 95% of people with spina bifida. And that group of people who are being wiped out is an increasing group. And it will soon be the designer baby. I think that the BBC...
Tom.
Medical.
I mean, I think that...
Tom.
You're right in the sense that there is a link between the kinds of debates that we have now around those issues and the Nazi euthanasia programme. I think one of the issues that is revealed here, though, is that we have...
In what way is there a link?
In the sense that the very first victim of the euthanasia programme under the Nazis was precisely murdered in the sense to set them free, to liberate them from their condition. That was entirely the kind of rhetoric that was used. But I think that what is revealed in this whole discussion is, in a sense, one of the problems about memorialising is that we have a kind of confusion about some of the history here. I mean, we've talked often about grand plans and these things being the same. Well, actually, they weren't the same. There wasn't a global plan to murder all physically disabled people. There was a very particular plan to remove them from German society because of a way that they were seen in terms of their economic contribution they could not make to a society at war.
Which is an argument used now.
Yeah, absolutely.
But the Nazis did have a global domination idea behind it, the final conclusion.
Yeah, but that then linked into a programme against the Jewish people, but it wasn't part of the same. It didn't come from the same ideological wellspring, and there was actually a very confined moment in the history of the Holocaust when there was a global plan to destroy all Jews as well.
But if the purpose of memorialization, which I think is what this debate is about building a better world, then I think the period since the Holocaust has been the bloodiest in human history. So I don't see the point. I don't see the point of what the practical utility is of remembering the Holocaust when actually what has happened is, and you only have to visit the Kigali Genocide Memorial and compare the artifacts in the Kigali Genocide Memorial with the artifacts in the Paris Holocaust Center, and you see the direct transfer of technology from Paris to Kigali, right down to the identity cards of the Hutus, Tutsis, and the Jews on the one hand, you see. So the Holocaust is important because it spawned a whole generation of technology and organizational science, which led to Cambodia, because the Cambodian genocidaires also studied in Paris and so on. However, my point is this, and this is, Holocaust is unique, we should remember it and all that. But I don't think that's enough. You know, when I was sitting in Darfur as the head of the United Nations in Sudan, trying to figure out, as we were witnessing the first genocide of the 21st century, in modern times, with all the technology at our disposal, the Holocaust did not, unfortunately, inspire me to be able to know what to do. Because while the same issues were there, you see, it's the sense of how to make the past relevant to the present. And if we don't do that, then these are just historical events.
How do we do it, and why didn't we learn that lesson?
I think
because there has been huge education about the Holocaust. There's been a massive amount of academic research. There are so many books. Yet why have we not learned that? And films, why have we not learned that lesson?
I think it's a question of each generation since the Holocaust learning to interpret the lessons and principles, bad and good, including those people who did helped others, in their own context, in their own generation. You can't learn lessons simply in the context of the past. You've got to turn those lessons, and our educational programs need to be able to equip people, children and adults and leaders, to interpret those lessons into the history of today. And I think the future of Holocaust memorialization is about keeping it relevant to today's context, not just remembering a historic past.
Neera, in a second, I promise you, bear with me. But yeah, Olivia, you're Chief Executive of the Holocaust Memorial Day.
Holocaust Memorial Day Trust.
Day Trust.
I think the conversation...
Respond to what we had there.
Yes, the conversation we've been having, I think, is touching on two things: commemoration and memorialisation, and education. They serve two different purposes, and both have a huge value in today's society. Holocaust Memorial Day is when they meet, when commemoration and education meet. Holocaust Memorial Day is when we do carve out that time each year when we can pay our respects, we can be thoughtful and respectful and commemorate the millions of people, the Jews who suffered in the Holocaust, all victims of Nazi persecution, and those who suffered in the genocides that have happened subsequently, because that is the educational imperative. When you learn about the Holocaust, everybody's reaction is never again. And we know that genocide has happened again and again.
So do we need to broaden the terms, broaden the definitions?
No, I think there's a very specific definition. It's a very specific crime to attempt to annihilate an entire people because of their faith or their community. And that's what we reflect on Holocaust Memorial Day.
So
and
what about, people will say, some at home will say, well, OK, what about the Armenian genocide, one of the great, you know, unspoken genocides of the 20th century? What about that?
There have been...
Deliberate attempt to get rid of a people.
Of course, on Holocaust Memorial Day, we reflect on what has happened so that, as Mukesh said, we can learn from it. And we know that people all around the country who mark Holocaust Memorial Day are inspired by what they are learning on that day to go on to learn more and to think about how they can use those lessons in their everyday lives. We know, in response to something Rabbi Laura said just now, how can you look someone in the eye and commit these kinds of atrocities? It's because genocide didn't come out of nowhere. The Holocaust didn't spring out of nowhere.
Is there a danger? I mean, do we do enough to recognise the other victims, not only of the Nazi Holocaust, but of other genocides as well? And is there a danger by over-concentration on this undeniably extraordinary, heinous, deliberate attempt to exterminate a race? Is there a danger that there is a hierarchy of victims?
This is not a competition of suffering.
But the Trust doesn't refer to the Armenian genocide as a genocide. You refuse to use that word, yes?
Holocaust Memorial Day was established to commemorate the Holocaust, and it came from international governments looking at what is their responsibility in a post-Holocaust world.
But you won't use the word genocide
Unfortunately, I don't see... I mean, I'm with you. You know, Olivia, I'm with you. But I, unfortunately, don't see in my country of birth, in India, you know, people commemorating Holocaust Memorial Day. I don't see the Chinese coming out in the way that we are going to come out tomorrow in London. Holocaust is a universal humanity event. It should be commemorated all over the world, but it seems to have reduced itself to a Western culture. I would like to see this in Africa, in Asia, but I don't see that happening.
Professor Neera, let's address the shadows that are still cast by what happened in the 1930s and 40s in Germany and in Poland.
I think part of the issue is that, yes, the racism and the pure race ideology has been very important. And as a teacher of sociology of racism, I know that teaching Holocaust in the schools has been extremely important to affect the pupils that have been exposed to it. However, the issue is that the Holocaust has not just been about ideology. The Jews in Eastern Europe, Lithuania, where my family was murdered as well, have been murdered years before the Jews in Germany. Why was it that? Because it was part of the imperial divide and rule regime of the Nazis about East Europe as a whole. Political and economic and social interests are always involved. So also today, the way that we memorize the Holocaust very often is very involved with some very political and economic interest. And part of the problem that we see is that on the one hand, we see how Israel is using very cynically, unfortunately, this very important memory of the Holocaust.
Totally
Absolute nonsense. I can explain this. You see, this is part of the issue, that the Holocaust is very important and has formatted all of my personal identity, for example. However, while some Jews, some Israelis says never again to Jews, the others of us, I say never again, as much as we can, to anybody, that we have to learn from the Holocaust respect for other people. This is why the fact that the Prime Minister of Israel, whenever there is a diplomatic visit, is taking people to Yad Vashem, the Memorial Museum, and in order to show them this, what happened to Jews in the Holocaust as a preventative measure for any critique of Israeli policies,
it's not
is very important. Can I just finish?
Let me get other people to address this who are extremely angry about what you've said, and then I'll of course let you come back, and whoever else wants to contribute on this particular point, it'll be with you a little bit later on. You, sir, Jack of Wise, were shouting disgusting when Nira was making her points. Why were you saying that? Because the Israelis don't use the Holocaust as a stick to beat the other nations with. It's absolutely ridiculous. I mean, if Netanyahu takes anybody to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, to show them the history of European Jewry and what happened to the Nobel Prize winners that would have been born had my father-in-law and 99% of his family not gone into Auschwitz, then, you know, what's the difference between that and somebody coming to London and going to the National Gallery or Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle? It's part of Jewish history. It's life. If you don't like it, don't go there. If it makes you uncomfortable, I'm sorry. That is history. That is reality. Israel was born from the ashes of the Holocaust. There would be no Israel without the Holocaust. The nations of the world felt so guilty in 1947-48, including Britain, who didn't do enough to save the victims and stop people getting into Palestine in the 1930s. That's why Israel was born. Nira, we'll move on from this in just a second, but I promised to go back to you. You used the word cynically exploiting. Did you use that word exploiting?
Yes, because even within Israel, even within the right-wing party Likud, there have been critiques of the way Netanyahu has been using it, and also claiming that this kind of visit reduce the raison d'etre of Israel to security for the Jews only, which of course is not something which can compete with the claim of the Palestinian.
Okay, let me ask Tom, who's a historian.
Can I just finish? The cynical thing, another thing, is that while youth groups are being sent from Israel to Auschwitz, waving the Israeli flag as a preparation for Israeli army rather than as a preparation for respect of
all right. Rubbish. I want to, if I can, move on to this. This is something we could debate, as you know, for hours. But there is a point, Rabbi Benji, about self-definition and the pitfalls of defining oneself by what happened in the past.
Absolutely. I think it's a mistake to think that the State of Israel is in any way compensation for the Holocaust. We mustn't look at it. Yes, it was born on the ashes of the Holocaust, but it shouldn't be seen as somehow compensating for the death of millions. Teaching high school students, there is a danger in people developing a sense of my persecution badge is bigger than yours and seeing themselves with a Judaism that's defined wholly by I'm Jewish because others came to kill me. Taking Israelis...
Do you see that?
I do see. I see also we're living in an age of even the games, the computer games that young people play, there's a dumbing down of violence. So they'll play violent computer games. So the sensitivity towards death and destruction is being eroded. So there's an equal necessity to commemorate such times. What was said before about one tragedy, paralleling it with another tragedy, why you couldn't learn in the United Nations from the Holocaust is because, as I've heard this morning, it's very difficult, really, to relate to another's tragedy. If I stub my toe, you're not going to feel my pain. And perhaps because of that, you can't learn one tragedy from another.
If you see people's children being slaughtered, you can relate to that if you have children or their
people don't relate.
grandparents. You can
we
relate
hear
to
all the
that.
time
Fellow
on the
human
news.
beings.
We hear all the time murders taking place in the street. There was a report last night on the radio. I was driving home of someone, a young child was murdered outside a pub Saturday morning. What do? We listen to the news and we get out our car and we go home and we carry on with life. We don't have an education system, we don't have a value system within our country that promotes the dignity of man, the respect for people. And until we can educate, it doesn't work to educate with tragedy. Young people don't want to hear of tragedy. That's not how they define themselves as a victim. There is a concept that many people espouse of third generation survivor. And in some way, we're all survivors of the Holocaust. But young people today don't really relate to that concept. They see themselves as having opportunities, as having a wonderful future, rather than as an inheritor of a tragedy.
But is there not, Rabbi Laura, is there not a collective psychological scar, as there is with many peoples, people of African descent, because of the Atlantic slave trade, for example, and the slave trade, of course, within Africa?
Yes.
That's something very difficult to expunge, isn't it?
It is. We have a collective scar. And the question is what you do with your scars. You talk about them, you cry about them, you admit it, and you do not expunge your anger on someone else. You go beyond that and look into the other in a different way. So you identify with other victims, just like Peter's raised. You work out what is the values that I have now. This happened, and I am messed up because of it. Something happened to me and my people that has scarred us. We have to acknowledge that.
Can you come to terms, and can you move on, and can you look ahead?
So moving on, I think is like a fluffy word. Sorry, but I just think it just. I don't know what moving on means.
Nikki,
living my life with values, understanding that people are different and that is fine, and being willing to have robust conversations with people that drive me potty. That is a way of moving. Moving on sounds like getting rid of.
Yeah, if you mean by moving on, forgive. I did a radio debate after bin Laden was killed, and the question there was, do we forgive? Can we forgive Osama bin Laden? Jews don't have a concept of forgiveness other than I, as a victim, can forgive the person that hurts me. It's not for us living today to offer some moving on and forgiving what went on. For Jews, remember that the word zachor, to remember, it's not just a passive moment of a moment's silence, an assembly where we all say never again, which we don't really mean, because we're never going to lose my house keys and we lose things all the time. So never again.
But it's not never again, is it? It's again and again. That's the problem.
But it's remembering in order to do something for the future.
Yeah. Peter, I want you to, you're a great human rights activist, but just on the point of the gay people, perhaps, I don't know, 40, 50,000 gay people were killed as well.
Yes.
Mark that for us.
What's interesting and shocking is that in many of the history books, the Nazi war on gay people is either a footnote or completely ignored. So William Shirer's great book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, actually blamed gay people for the Holocaust and then did not mention at all their mass rounding up, arrest and extermination.
A manifestation of pure, unadulterated decadence by the Third Reich, wasn't it?
Yeah, well, absolutely.
Ironically, Ernst Röhm
and people don't realise that
story.
The head of the Gestapo, Heinrich Himmler, in the 1930s set out a programme for what he called the extermination of abnormal existence. Yes. That was his programme to exterminate all gay people, and he set up a doctor, SS Dr. Karl Wernet, to oversee this programme and to experiment on gay prisoners in Buchenwald and Neuengamme concentration camps. What is truly shocking is that Dr. Wernet was held in a British-controlled prisoner of war camp in 1946, and he was allowed to escape to Argentina, where he lived openly until his death in 1985. None of the Allies, no one sought to bring him to justice and to put him on trial for the terrible things he did. So there's real double standards here. Some Nazi doctors were put on trial, others weren't.
This is interesting, isn't it, Tom? How we cast ourselves as, the noble heroes in all this. I want to talk more about the fluffy phrase moving on. Some would see it as reconciliation, some would see it as in some way coming to terms with it and looking ahead. But just on that point raised by Peter, Werner was his name? Wernet, and Mengele as well. There was a lot of them who escaped justice. Churchill and others knew about this quite early on, didn't they?
I mean, I think that one of the questions around memorialising and remembering is that we need to do it critically, and we need to look at ourselves critically. So I think in Britain we need to use Holocaust Memorial Day to look at Britain's record in a critical manner, and that's a record of not admitting refugees, of preventing refugees from reaching Palestine and any other part of the British Empire, and it's also a record in the post-war era of a justice programme that was, severely compromised and indeed ended very quickly because of actually the Cold War took over as being the most important aspect, and ultimately a number of prominent Nazi criminals are allowed to go free.
And
indeed
utilised as well.
And there were campaigns in Britain around not trying these people. I mean, Erich von Manstein is one example as not trying this man because in a sense he was a Christian European and would be an ally in the Cold War. So there are lots of critical issues around Britain's history that need to be examined, and one of the things I think is slightly problematic about Holocaust Memorial Day is we've turned it sometimes into a kind of good news story for Britain, and sometimes we suggest Britain's only role is that of haven, of liberator.
The Kindertransport.
The Kindertransport is identified routinely as part of Britain's wonderfully welcoming attitude towards refugees, and we don't talk about the wartime Home Secretary whose refugee policy was entirely based around preventing refugees from reaching these shores. So I think that and that's also a way in which we could relate it to today in terms of some of the rather shocking debates that we have about around immigration and refugee policy in the present, which are somehow we are protected from in a way by saying that the Holocaust was unique as well, because in a sense that was different. So we welcomed refugees when it was different.
I mean, these points are entirely relevant to reconciling ourselves to it, and by seeing these people as horned devils. They were people like us who did this, and we were not blameless, if you want to use it, a them and us or a we, Eve.
Well, to some extent, I think that's true. The Nazis, the perpetrators, weren't horned devils. They were human beings, though human beings in a very dreadful moral condition. I think it's reasonable to say that hatred and contempt for what the Nazis did is perfectly reasonable. It's a perfectly appropriate response to what they did. It's not the only available response, but it's not one that I would ever dream of telling other people, particularly victims, that they should abjure. If they hate and feel contempt for the Nazis, that's not unreasonable. But it is possible to have other responses, and I think there is a case for forgiveness, but a case that's hemmed around with a lot of qualifications. I think we can consider what the Nazis did to themselves in perpetrating this dreadful genocide. And I would like to say that, though I entirely agree with people who say there are other genocides which are legitimately to be memorialised, that seems entirely right to me. It also seems right to me that we are prepared in Europe to give a special place to remembrance of the Holocaust, because this was a European horror. This was something that happened in Europe, was perpetrated by Europeans, not all of whom were Nazis. So it's appropriate for us to take this very, very seriously.
Tom, back with you in a second.
Sure.
The other side of that is that the victims were also European, so it's rather convenient, isn't it, for us to remember the genocide in which we are, in a sense, the victims, and not the genocides in which we were the perpetrators.
If what happened with the Khmer Rouge had happened on our own doorstep, would we look at the 1.5 million murders there by Pol Pot in a very different light?
Well, I think how do we, in Britain, how do we remember the Empire, for example? Where is our day for remembering
in Belgium, how do they remember King Leopold II, who killed millions and millions of people in the then Belgian Congo?
Why does it have to be this discussion about competitive suffering? I find it quite sickening, actually. I'm very privileged to be sitting two doors away, if you like, from a Holocaust survivor.
Well, some people do see a hierarchy of suffering.
Yes, but all it takes for evil to flourish is for good men to do nothing. We can be bystanders of any evil act. And I think, first of all, I'm sorry to come back, but shame on you to politicise the Holocaust. The Nazis had very, very clear plans for the fate of British Jewry, and also, I imagine, for the homosexual community, for disabled people, for anybody. There would have been a lot of empty seats here had Hitler succeeded. And we need to learn from this. So, for example, you bring in Israel. How did all the persecution start? It started off by boycotting Jews. Look at the way Israel, for example, Israeli products are arbitrarily boycotted. We should stand up and say, in a free society, why is that allowed to happen? Why are academics being smothered in our universities because they may be Israeli or may have a connection with Israel? This is how it started in the 1930s, and anti-Semitism went way back before then.
Peter. Can I bring back to the question of our place, Britain's place in this whole question, and the tendency to look at the Holocaust with a sense of moral superiority.
Yes.
As other people have pointed out, it was Britain that invented concentration camps in the Boer War.
And
we created them. And then after the Second World War, we set up concentration camps in Kenya and Malaya to suppress the legitimate and rightful claim of those people to be self-governing and independent.
And so it was British government in the Security Council in 1994, alongside the Americans, who stopped action to stop the genocide in Rwanda. So the best way to remember, the best way to remember the survivors of the Holocaust is to consider now what we do with the survivors of the other genocides.
So why then, Professor Camilla, why do we see these things in a different, which probably maybe is an obvious answer in some people's minds, but just tell us, articulate it for us. We see the 60 million people killed before and after the Cultural Revolution by Mao, those killed by Stalin, tens of millions of people killed by Stalin, but deliberate famine and direct murder, Pol Pot, Rwanda, you know, a scar on the Clinton presidency. Why do we
Sudan and Syria?
Why, yes, Syria, Darfur. Why do we see these things differently from our podium here?
Well, I think one of the reasons we see these things differently is because we don't personalize and internalize. I think your point about empathy. And in this globalized world, where on one hand, it's a paradoxical world. On the one hand, we know about people suffering thanks to the BBC, we hear about it instantly, what's happening in other parts of the world. On the other hand, it has become so globalized that we fail to connect to the people next door to us. And then the real politics of the situation as it is. We're talking whether or not the British leadership should be going to Saudi Arabia and whether the British flag should be flying at half-mast because the Saudi king has died. And it's all been connected to that, to the politics, as opposed to recognizing the human dimensions of these tragedies.
Ibi, can I ask you a question?
Go ahead.
Well, something I want to address as well. Because there's been so much debate about, obviously, freedom of speech. We've discussed it here, it's been discussed endlessly elsewhere, quite properly. What do you think about the fact that in some countries in Europe, Holocaust denial is a crime?
Well, I have only been speaking in the last 5-6 years. I had a different life before them. I have spoken since then to well over 25,000 young people. I don't quite know. The main problem I find is that unless we can, from the bottom up, make a difference. My grandchildren, when they went into nursery, had played with children of different colors. They played the same. They didn't know whether somebody was black, yellow, pink, or what. They played happily. Where along the line does it come in that some people are different from others? Where does the us and them syndrome come in? Where do we stop this? And unless we do stop it, and unless we educated young people, all young people, to that there is no difference, that under the skin we are all the same.
Absolutely right. Let me ask that. Let me bring it back if I can. Audience, in just a minute. I'm going to skip round the audience in 1 second.
You say absolutely right, but that's not absolutely right.
Well, it's not absolutely right because it's never going to happen.
No,
you know.
well, because it is going to happen, because then I think it will happen, and I'm a great believer in humanity.
Let me. I want to cut the poll. Let me get back to this question I did ask. I did ask a question, and I want to address this question.
If you come back to me, I'll probably
Holocaust, and I'll try. I'll try. Holocaust denial, Laura. Should it be a crime in these countries?
It's a crime because crimes that incite hate and violence are crimes.
But it's so nutty. Shouldn't you just let... It's so cranky. Shouldn't you let people say it?
I so wish that you were right. It is not, because it has seeped through into people's...
If you make it a crime, it then festers, doesn't it? And it's conspiratorial...
No, when you name something a crime, you take it to court. You bring it out into the public zone. You define clearly, again and again, what has happened to all the different victims, and certainly not just Jews, and Holocaust denial is wrong, and you bring it out and you make it a crime so that it can be seen as such.
So if somebody said only 1 million people died, is that Holocaust denial?
Did you just do that with your hand? That's the whole point, that people can say...
No, that's what they would say. That's what they would say.
Yeah,
David
I think
is that...
we have clear facts, and they need to be brought out. And the agenda behind the denial is the same agenda of destroying a people.
Peter, then the audience. Peter.
Holocaust denial is factually wrong and morally abhorrent, but ideas should not be criminalised. Even offensive ideas should not be criminalised. If someone incites violence or hatred, that's different. But to discuss or make a point, however misguided, that's the price we pay for living in a free society. And the best way to defeat the Holocaust deniers is with the evidence and counter-arguments.
But it does incite hatred. It does incite hatred, because if you deny the Holocaust, you give every single anti-Semite, every single person who is that way inclined, a stick to beat. Yes, of course you do. Of course you do. Absolutely you do.
Is it essential? Is it essential to freedom of speech? Is it not essential to freedom of speech that you let people express these toxic ideas? You expose them as what they are, absolute nonsense.
Tell the Greeks who've got the Golden Dawn. Tell the Hungarians who've got Jobbik. Tell the neo-Nazis in Norway that shot children with a machine gun. They are around today. They have not learned the lessons of the Holocaust.
OK, audience. Yeah, you had your hand up, Ray. What would you like to say? I'm going to go around here. Lots of points as brief as possible.
Hi, Nicky.
Good morning.
The point I'd like to make is I was raised as a Muslim, and I grew up in a culture where Jews were demonised. Holocaust was completely denied. It was claimed that the Jews are exploiting this to gain power, etc. So to say that we have achieved everyone's educated in Holocaust and it's acknowledged and it's not such a big deal is a complete nonsense, because in huge portions of the Islamic and Muslim communities there are children who are growing up with a counter-narrative that the Holocaust is a fabrication, it's the state of Israel, it's propaganda, it's Jewish propaganda. So to say that it's been commemorated, it's achieved education is complete nonsense. There's huge groups out there who completely villainize and have no understanding, true understanding of the... are completely in denial and who have anti-Semitic views.
Thank you. And you, Madam, good morning.
Good morning. I want to say, as a child of a concentration camp survivor, my father, who was in the camps for 4.5 years, and my mother, who was a hidden child in the war, I feel very strongly that we must commemorate the Holocaust and educate about the Holocaust. The Holocaust has become, for me, as a child, a bland term. We must remember what happened to an individual, how this individual was affected himself, his family, his wider family, his friends, his potential in life. It was murder. Murder on a mass scale, murder of life, murder of intellectualism, murder of culture, murder of souls. I want to say what happened also to my parents. My father was liberated in Dachau. He was one of 4. His sister survived. His parents were murdered. His brother of 4 was murdered. And his sister of 11 was murdered. He became a doctor and a dentist and became the president of ex-concentration camp inmates, Jewish and non-Jewish, and fought for humanity. We adopted a non-Jewish lady, a Catholic lady, as our grandmother, and to the end of his life he treated German patients. He was a believer in the human faith. Yes, Rabbi Jana, we're scarred, but we as Jews with our faith believe in living and in the living. And if stuff happens to us, what do? We pray, we do repentance, we give charity. We do not counteract. And for that, as a faith, when Hitler wanted to wipe out a faith and a nation with so much giving and so much kindness, we must never forget.
Gentleman at the back with the glasses. Yeah.
If you're going to ban Holocaust denial based on the fact it engenders hate, are you also going to ban the Bible because of the death penalties for gay people, the support for genocide of the Amalekites, and so on and so forth?
And a gentleman over there on the right. Hello.
Yeah, just to follow up on a few points that the panel have been speaking on. You know, it's not about comparison. It's not about competing. You know, at the end of the day, every human life, every human drop of blood, like the lady was saying, is equal. You know, I'm a Christian. I believe that we're all made in the image of God. And I just wanted to pick up on a separate point by a couple of panel members.
As quickly as you can.
Yeah,
we're coming towards.
At the end of the day, you know, picking up on this thing of, you know, we have to be careful that we don't buy into this sort of, in a sense, national hypocrisy. You know, the lady spoke about, you know, is it because it was a European issue? You pointed, you know, if Europeans didn't do it, then we wouldn't pay attention. Another, you know, mass genocide at 1.2 is how Europe was built on, the transatlantic slave trade, which we built on. 30 million people over the course of 300 years, displaced. Cultures, like the lady was saying, unique again, that was unique. Cultures, people transplanted 3,000 miles away, cultures destroyed.
And the collective psychological
that was something
scar.
that we participated in as a country. That was us.
Yeah.
But we also have to remember today and act upon it. Just as many Jews were turned away by Britain, fleeing persecution in the 1930s, today, when refugees come to this country, having often been jailed and tortured, we put them in asylum detention centres, we treat them like common criminals, they flee a jailer, and we put them in prison while their asylum case is being considered. And that is not right. It shows that we have not learnt the lessons of history and that we're still treating refugees in an appalling, shameful way.
Paul, very quickly. Want to finish this very quickly?
Any society that says any individual is worth less than any other is doomed to failure. And we do that in Britain now to a vast array of people, from the disabled to gay people to immigrants, everybody, and Jews.
Rabbi Benji, what is the lesson that you want your pupils to learn about this week and every other week?
So over the years, we've run Holocaust assemblies, and just to tell Peter, we've dealt with the gay community, we've dealt with disability awareness. A couple of years ago, we had Muslim kids come into our school, and we spoke about how Muslims rescued Jews in the Holocaust, and they gave our story and we gave their story. It's really about the dignity of each individual. It's about learning the history, learning the lessons from history, but trying to broaden the sense there's the Holocaust, but there are other genocides, and trying to educate young people to respect life, to choose life, not to see themselves as victims, to seize the fact that they've got opportunities in this country and all around the world. They have a scar. They're children, grandchildren of those with bigger scars, but to begin to start the dialogue with others who are different from them. The former chief rabbi wrote that religion often was to blame because religion that said if you don't follow my path, you're subhuman in some way. That we need to eradicate that particular message from religious community, that if you don't share my religion, you don't share my humanity. We educate towards a shared and a joint humanity.
Moving towards the universal.
Yeah, we have to, absolutely. And that's the only way when you give young people who are full of dreams, full of aspirations for a better future, they're the generation that can dream. We're jaded, we're adults, we're full of our own scars and baggage that we can't imagine a better future. Young people don't have that baggage. Young people don't have that baggage, and they have the opportunity to dream of the future they want to make for themselves.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you all very much indeed. As ever, the debate continues online. Join us next Sunday from Glasgow. From now, it's goodbye. Thank you for watching. Goodbye from everybody here in Salford.